Catgirls are not furries. A comprehensive analysis by Dub. Introduction. So many people debate whether catgirls actually fall under the furry umbrella, but in this slideshow I will be analyzing the different terms, providing examples, and giving thoughtful analysis to prove that catgirls are not furries. Section 1. Definition and general differences. What are catgirls? Catgirls are human-like female characters with minor feline features such as cat ears and sometimes a tail. Sometimes they may have fangs or slight cat-like behavioral traits. They originate mainly from anime, manga, and Japanese pop culture. What are furries? Anthropomorphic animal characters with a mix of human and animal traits. Includes digitigrade legs, full-body fur, snouts, and whiskers. Now, in reality, it's believed that liking, being attracted to furry creatures, makes you a furry. In this sense, many people who are attracted to anthropomorphic characters also consider themselves furries. But for the sake of this argument, we're going to assume that a furry is just an anthropomorphic character until we get a little further into this analysis. Exhibit A. Key differences in appearances. Catgirls are essentially humans with slight cat traits. There are no full body fur or major anatomical changes. They are basically just human, and they're usually depicted with real feline characteristics. Furries, on the other hand, are fully anthropomorphic. They're more animal than human in most cases. They have full body fur and act like animals. Usually, in most depictions, they're also just people in fur suits. Otherwise, the former still applies. Section 2. Scientific and biological differences. Species classification. The catgirl, aka Homo sapien nekomimi. They're essentially a base human with minor feline traits. These modifications would be so minor that the species classification couldn't even fall under the Felis catus category. A Homo catus would also be scientifically inaccurate, as that would imply that they are actually derived from cats, but they're actually not, they are human. Nekomimi literally just means cat ears, so for the sake of distinction, we'd associate nekomimi with Homo sapien. Therefore, in general, catgirls would still be Homo sapiens. The furry, however, would probably be considered, depending on the furry animal in choice, something entirely different, such as Canis sapiens, Felis anthropomorphus, or Vulpes sapiens. They would be a hypothetical new species, a fusion of both human and feral animal traits, to a point where classification as a Homo sapien is no longer possible. A furry would actually be its own species entirely. At the very least, it would actually be a heavily engineered hybrid species with distinct biology. Therefore, a catgirl and a furry are both different species with no evolutionary overlap. Now let's look at the phenotypes and anatomy of the catgirl. We have standard human skin with minor modifications for fur, such as on the tail and cat ears. Otherwise, they are human. Let's look at the phenotypes and anatomy of a furry. You'll have an entire body covered in fur. This would mean specialized hair follicles, sebaceous glands, and insulation mechanisms. It would likely also have adaptations for temperature regulation since they'd be covered in fur, and the fur density, unlike a catgirl, would be akin to an actual animal rather than human hair. Let's look at the skeletal structure now of a catgirl. Compared to a human, the only modifications that would actually be required for a catgirl skeletal structure would be small structural changes to the skull to accommodate cat ears. This would likely just be like minor modifications, like a slight slit for a cat ear to actually come out. And a functional tail would need an extended spinal cord / tailbone, which would require a slightly longer spine, but it would still actually be within human variation, which means if you were to look at a catgirl skeleton, you might not be able to tell that it actually had a tail. Therefore, the only difference here is in ears and possibly an extended tailbone to accommodate a tail. Therefore, a catgirl's would be approximately 99.8% identical to human skeletal structure. The furry skeletal structure and bone morphology. Now, I can't actually get a good graphic because of the immense differences between a furry and any other living being as a reference. I can't put a furry and a human skeleton next to each other. A furry would have major skeletal differences depending on its animal influence. They would have digitigrade legs, which basically means they would walk on their toes instead of their feet, or on the bottom of their feet, and they would require local motion similar to their animal origin, which means also stronger calf bones and calf muscles, etc. They would have a snout, which means a protruding muzzle would require an entirely different skull structure, which would change your sinus cavities, your brain arrangement, your sense of smell and taste, your tongue placement. Everything's different. And different hand morphology. Furry hands are not even close to that of humans. They would have paw-like fingers and claws, and their hands would be fundamentally different in dexterity. Overall, I'd say a furry is much closer to a human-modified anthro than an anthro-modified human. Now let's look at a genetic breakdown. This is section 2.5. We're not quite done yet. Given what we have, let's see what's modified in a catgirl. We have species, still human. We have Homo sapien nekomimis. Fur, only on ears and tail, slightly modified. Ears, slightly modified, cat-like, mobile, better hearing. Tail, slightly modified. Skeletal structure, slightly modified. You'd only need those minor changes we talked about for ears and a tailbone. Possibly slightly improved reflexes depending on how genetically engineered they are, and possibly minor night vision boost. Again, these two are completely optional. And brain structure, completely the same. Vocal cords and speech, all the same. Reproduction, the same. Now, this is a little bit tricky, but according to most fiction, we could say that a catgirl can theoretically reproduce with a human, which means that reproduction is also the same. Metabolism and diet is also similar to, or exactly the same to, a standard human omnivorous diet. Let's look at an anthro animal, aka the furry. Species. You're going to have a fully modified new species. Let's assume you have a dog furry, anthropomorphic dog. You'd have Canis sapiens. Fur. Full body fur coat, full animal ears, large functional tail with balance adaptation. That's fully modified. Skeletal structure, again, fully modified. You need to accommodate for everything. Reflexes, obviously, this is no longer optional. If you are doing all of this, you're obviously going to have better reflexes, especially with a snout and possibly animal senses of smell and eyes. Now, brain structure, altered neurology, different sensory processing, possible instinct-driven behavior. So this basically means that they're most likely going to act more animal than a catgirl would act cat, fully modified. Vocal cords and speech would also have to be fully modified because of the different skeletal structure. We would have to move the larynx and everything else, your throat, to actually allow speech, assuming they did speak. Like a human, and reproduction would likely be incompatible, and the metabolism and diet would also possibly be specialized, such as carnivorous. This, I guess, is optionally, but if it is modified, it's fully modified. Now, what you're all waiting for. Aren't catgirls part furry? Section 2.6. Every scientific inaccuracy in the catgirls are part furry argument. Taxonomic and evolutionary evidence. We've already touched upon the fact that catgirls and furries are not the same evolutionarily, because they actually belong to fundamentally different species, that being Homo sapien and blank Anthropomorphous. Now this matters because species don't actually exist on a percentage form. As you can see from this graph here, you actually have a common ancestral species that diverges into two distinct species over an evolutionary time period. Now note that in the case of catgirls, the common ancestral species would probably be Homo sapien, except in a catgirl's case, they wouldn't even be different because they are Homo sapien. Now, keeping this graph in mind, we can see that a wolf is also not X% dog. A wolf is a wolf. Though they diverged from a dog, a wolf is not X% dog. Nor is a human X% chimp. Because evolutionary divergence is binary and not a sliding spectrum. Here's an example of real-world genetic modification. We have the CRISPR genetic modification. If you're interested, you can see my other slideshow on how to create catgirls. Biologists have already actually managed to modify the human embryos and made them immune to HIV. Are these experiments 50% virus-resistant species? No, they're not. They're still human. They're not 50% HIV-resistant species, they're just a modified human. Let's look at every logical fallacy in the catgirls are part furry argument. A false equivalency is an informal fallacy in which an equivalence is drawn between two subjects based on flawed or false reasoning. This argument declares that animal traits equals anthropomorphism. This is false equivalence. Now I have the Sorites paradox. This is a logical fallacy that arises when unclear predicates are used to create a false continuum, this being that evolution and furriness is a spectrum. This argument rests on an undefined spectrum of percentage. Think about this. Does a human with slightly sharper teeth become 5% wolf? Let me expand on this. This arises when vague predicates and the idea that removing or adding one instance doesn't change the overall property, which leads to contradictory conclusions. For example, if you have a pile of sand and you remove a grain, is it still a pile of sand? You'd probably say yes. But keep doing that and think to yourself, at what point does that remaining single grain cease to be a pile? Now, if we assume that a single grain doesn't change the property, then that actually contradicts our initial understanding of a pile, which completely draws a huge fallacy between what we actually logically consider distinguished and indistinguishable. Now, what does this have to do with catgirls and furries? Many people argue that catgirls are part furries. This creates the false equivalence that furriness is a spectrum. Now, if we continue to remove traits from a furry until you eventually get what is close to a catgirl, you'd have to create a borderline of which it is no longer a furry and is now a catgirl. And, like we said, this creates a huge logical paradox because it would contradict our initial understanding of both and therefore completely void the idea that furriness is a spectrum. So even assuming that furriness was a spectrum, one cannot logically argue that there is no distinction between a catgirl and a furry. Now, given this, let's debunk that one image. You've all seen this before. Now, this misrepresents biological classification. It assumes that a fully anthro character exists on the same evolutionary scale as a catgirl. This is wrong. And the image also relies on the vague definitions, which creates the false continuum, aka the Sorites paradox that we just discussed. And obviously that in turn creates the false equivalence, which means animal traits does not equal anthropomorphism. As we can see here, this is actually 100% Homo sapien if we're considering it what would be a genetically modified catgirl, and it would have no relation to what would be considered a Felis catus, which is just a cat. And this is all false because evolution doesn't work like that. Now, community, culture, and society. From now on, furry will be referring to someone who finds the idea of anthropomorphic animals in art, fiction, cartoons, costumes, or other media to be appealing. It will also be referring to people who wear fursuits. Furry is an identity. Furry culture is a fandom, and it's a personal identity. Many people call themselves furries and consider it a key part of their identity. They create personas, they go to conventions, and there's a whole community around furriness. But catgirls are not real. In contrast to the self-identification of furries, catgirls are simply not a thing. They're a fictional trope that only exists in anime, manga, and games, and there is no quote-unquote catgirl community in the same way there's a furry community. And nobody really, for the most part, nobody really identifies as a catgirl. Liking a catgirl does not make you a catgirl. Additionally, the entire concept of catgirl is just purely fictional at the moment. Again, if you're interested, the next video will contain my theory on how to create catgirls. Okay, Exhibit B, Media and Community. Furries actively contribute and support their own fandom. Furries commission, create, and consume art, comics, and animations centered on the anthropomorphic characters. Here's an example of WikiFur, which is basically a Wikipedia community for furries. Also, the entirety of the fandom's content is self-generated, which is pretty respectable, just saying. And catgirl content is created by the anime and manga industry. There is some independent catgirl media, I guess you could say Neko, for example, but they're typically just a trope character that are inserted into unrelated anime or manga series. Fans don't create their own nekomimi / catgirl personas in the same way, or they typically don't, and the entire concept exists within pre-established franchises, rather than being driven by a community. Now, the social and cultural perception of each group. Furries are a social group with positive and negative perceptions. Sometimes they're seen as gross, sometimes they're oppressed. Every furry is different, and some are good, but some are bad. Furries have a large community where they support each other and stuff. On the other hand, there's just no community for catgirls. A catgirl enjoyer is just an anime fan, and they're usually perceived as such. Let's look at the cultural fluidity in both communities. Section 4. Catgirls are an extension of furry expression. So I've heard the argument that the furry community isn't strictly defined by the extent of anatomical modifications, but by the celebration of anthropomorphic aesthetics. So under this view, anybody with a noticeable animal trait such as cat ears or a tail belongs to a broader category of furries. In this way, the boundaries between catgirl and furry can be viewed as a matter of cultural expression rather than biology. However, I would argue that cultural identification is different than scientific classification. So although these fandoms might overlap, let's just say that some enthusiasts may enjoy both catgirl aesthetics and furry expression, but the crossover in fandoms does not actually imply that a catgirl is scientifically or anatomically part furry. And obviously, the established taxonomy and scientific standards remain, regardless of what the community may think. Catgirls are by definition entirely human. Representation and identity. Catgirls, their identity is rooted in human culture, anime tropes, otaku aesthetics, which is celebrated for its cuteness and human relatability. Furries, however, are built around the concept of embodying a different species with non-human physical and behavioral traits. Now, the final verdicts and conclusion, Section 5. Let's look at what we have learned. In Section 1, we looked at the fundamental differences in appearance and definition. We discovered that catgirls are humans with cat ears and a tail. Furries are anthropomorphic animals. In Section 2, we looked at the specific scientific and biological differences between the hypothetical catgirl and furry. A catgirl and furry would be two distinct species on separate evolutionary paths. In Section 2.8, we debunked the catgirl are part furry argument. We discovered that species do not exist on a percentage spectrum. The Sorites paradox also suggests that it's logically impossible to argue that such a spectrum exists. Therefore, catgirls physically cannot be X% furry. In Section 3, we took a little step away from science and looked at the cultural differences between the furry community and catgirl enjoyers. Our verdict was that catgirls are not real and there's no such thing as a catgirl community. On the other hand, the opposite is true for furries. In Section 4, we addressed the overlap in culture and fandom between catgirls and furries. Our final verdict was that even though there is a cultural overlap and subjective interpretation within fandoms, scientific, anatomical, and taxonomic distinctions remain clear. Also, it's the individual's choice whether or not to identify as a furry. In conclusion, this is why catgirls are not furries. Biologically, they remain 100% human. In contrast, furries are an entirely new species. Culturally, catgirls are rooted in anime culture and otaku culture. Furries have a real-world subculture which involves their identity expression, fursuits, and personas. In media, catgirls are consistently portrayed as humans, maybe with animal flair, while furries are represented as fully anthropomorphic animals with distinct species traits. Fandom identity. We discovered that liking both does not equate them. Catgirls are an aesthetic fantasy, and furries are a community. Thank you for watching.